From expressing support for this Swedish teenager to posting about fires in the rainforest and marching in the streets, millions of humans are demanding governments do something to help the environment and wage war against climate change. But very few are focusing on one of the biggest threats to the environment and human life: the US military and its literally endless imperial wars and incursions. It's well established that the US Department of Defense, which has 800 bases around the world and troops deployed in 80 countries in the name of counterterrorism, is the largest institutional user of petroleum and correspondingly the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, as Netta Crawford, chair of Boston University's Political Science Department and director of the Watson Institute's Cost of War project, has explained. And as Crawford notes, Department of Defense emissions for all military operations from 2001 to 2017 are estimated to be about 766 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. More than half of that is a direct result of U.S. overseas contingency operations in the war on terror in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria. Further, the American government's efforts to defend oil in the Persian Gulf, for example, Trump's deployment of troops following an attack on Saudi oil supplies, also contribute to emissions by continuing to sanction the highly subsidized fossil fuel industry and propping up dependence on it. The American government's wars and the sheer size of the military necessary to sustain them have made the U.S. military one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters in the world among whole countries. The U.S. military accounts for 77 to 80% of all U.S. federal government energy consumption since 2001. That's because maintaining an imperial military requires everything from fueling jets that drop the bombs to the energy consumed during reconstruction of damaged and destroyed infrastructure. As researchers from Lancaster University calculated in a recent study, in 2017 alone, the U.S. military purchased about 269,230 barrels of oil a day and emitted more than 25,000 kilotons, or 25 million tons, of carbon dioxide emissions by burning those fuels. In just 2017, the Air Force purchased $4.9 billion worth of fuel, the Navy $2.8 billion, the Army $947 million, and the Marines $36 million. In fact, a 2015 study found humanity's lust for oil is inextricably linked to invasion. The likelihood of a foreign power intervening in a country's internal conflicts is higher when there's oil to be seized. But it's not just this fuel consumption that hurts the environment. The American military has a terrible track record of spewing toxic chemicals around the world. Their widespread use of Agent Orange in Vietnam destroyed 4.5 million acres of land, including forests and swamps, polluting the soil with the active chemical dioxin, which remains there, contaminating earth and water to this day. As UC Riverside environmental historian David Biggs further noted, in heavily bombed areas of Vietnam, herbicides pooled in bomb craters and washed into rivers and other irrigation channels, penetrating the same spaces where locals fished and grew crops. As Americans departed Vietnam, meanwhile, they disposed of chemicals improperly, depositing them in landfills around former bases. The U.S. military's use of Puerto Rico as a testing ground for its bombs and chemical weapons has destroyed and contaminated ecosystems. In 1998 alone, the U.S. dropped 23,000 bombs on one Puerto Rican island. This is to say nothing of decades of nuclear testing, which the Russian government has performed excessively as well. Yet some people believe that the same entity responsible for some of the most egregious environmental destruction and some of the world's worst pollution should lead the charge in saving the planet. While it's very nice that the military wants to go green, praising and celebrating this and propping up the military as a noble leader in this fight only further legitimizes the human cost of war this military inflicts, no matter who's president, and continues to ignore the human and environmental suffering caused. And unfortunately, many of the loudest voices demanding action on the climate either ignore or don't pay sufficient attention to this issue. And part of this is because Democratic Messiah Barack Obama desensitized much of the left to war, continuing Bush's debacles and expanding them with drones, approving massive military budgets and growing executive military powers that have been passed on to Trump. People were so busy defending Obama's incursions. 26,000 bombs dropped in 2016 alone. They abandoned the anti-war spirit they had when a Republican was president. What this really shows is that despite the good intentions of those calling for governments to take action on the climate, the American empire and endless war are so ubiquitous that even those wanting to make a difference for the environment are largely blind to this massive threat to the cause they claim to champion. Though environmental activists decry the innumerable deaths they say will inevitably come with climate change, people are dying and suffering right now, not only from radiation and other environmental contaminants, but also through the flagrant use of weapons of war on innocent civilians and the vicious cycle of U.S. militarism creating terrorists and then using said terrorists to justify further intervention. So if you really care about the environment and humankind, drop your apathy toward war and empire, resensitize yourself to the destruction they cause, and hold one of the biggest culprits accountable.